All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this channel, Tools for Architecture. We are a design unit of architecture at the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London, exploring the potential of virtual architecture in the immersive internet, this year with a specific focus on gatherings in virtual spaces. And today we have the enormous pleasure of welcoming the one and only Kent Bai, who leads the Voices of VR podcast, among many other things, with us today, who's going to give a talk and answer questions from our students titled The Art of Gathering Virtually, Experiential Design Lessons from the Virtual Conferences of the 2020 Pandemic. And I'm sure he'll also cover a lot of other interesting topics surrounding this emerging field of virtual togetherness and virtual gatherings that is so pressing and kind of immediate for the entire world right now. But of course, is something that Kent has been exploring for many, many, many years. I think Voices of VR has been running for 6 years with thousands of episodes up and available for free and sponsored by his Patreons online. We just go ahead before we invite Kent in to give his speech to go to his Patreon to support him and the amazing work he's doing and bringing this coverage to the whole world, which I would just say from our side, both in teaching and in practice, we rely heavily upon as both an archive and as a way for getting news about what's happening in this emerging field. So again, we're super happy to have Kent here, and welcome, Kent. Great to see you again.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Frederick. I'm really excited to be here. So excited that I stayed up all night mashing together like 10 talks all into one. So we'll see how far I get into this. But I'm going to, it's going to be in 4 sections. And I think at the end of each section, I'm going to pause and have some questions for a little bit. And then hopefully you'll get through the end of it. And then I think I have a hard stop at like 10:45. So it's like over 2 hours from now. And so I'm happy to stay up to that last moment. I have another talk that I'm going to be, another podcast interview right after this. All right. So this is the Art of Gathering Virtually, Experiential Design Lessons from Virtual Conferences of the 2020 Pandemic. So yeah, as Frederick said, my name's Kent Bai. I do the Voices of VR podcast. I think I've recorded somewhere between 1,400 to 1,500 interviews and published about 2/3 of it so far, and just helping to document the evolution of the medium. And I just changed my Twitter bio recently to aspiring philosopher. I don't have a philosophy background. My background's in electrical engineering, but I tend to try to look at things a little bit philosophically and try to find some of the deeper patterns. And I think in this talk today, I'm going to try to show some of those patterns and actually be in a little bit of response to this program that you're doing here, trying to put together this report for the civic program there at the Architectural Association. So this is going to be 4 different sections here. Lessons from the Virtual Reality Conferences 2020. Just going through a short little narrative of some of my lessons learned. Then I'm going to do a brief response to your program that I watched, like the 4-hour presentation, and then sort of contrast that with my experiential design approach that I personally use. And then talk a little bit about the technological architecture and the evolution of technology, and then into some of the design trade-offs. So, okay, let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, so the first wave of virtual conferences in 2020, there was a lot of different events that happened. As things started to go virtual, I gave a talk at the Educators in VR and Altspace. There was HTC Ecosystem Conference and Engage. The IEEE VR was a big one that I pretty much immersed myself in for the entire time, as well as Verbella for the Laval Virtual. And then there was some other ones that happened along the way. I think VRTO was doing some interesting innovations. But then the final one here, Burning Man, I immersed myself in for quite a bit with that as well. And I think there was lots of interesting innovations that happened there. But I'm going to be focusing this talk mostly on my experiences from Laval Virtual, a little bit from IEEE, and then I'll have a few things to say about Burning Man. So I have done a number of different Twitter threads where I just go into these conferences and kind of keep a running track of my phenomenological experiences, taking screenshots, and just as I go along, making comments about how people interact with these virtual spaces. So these threads here, if you just search in Twitter from Kent by and then thread with any of these, they should come up, or I could also send them along afterwards. But the IEEE VR, the Laval Virtual, and then my top 40 Black Rock City VR from Burning Man. And also have interviews for at least two of these as well. So, okay, what is a conference? And I should say that the um, your mandate that you're looking at all virtual gatherings, and I'm going to be focusing here at the first part just on like virtual conferences, because as a professional conference, that's essentially where I would do my work. I would go to these conferences and roam the hallways doing these different interviews with people. And it was kind of like this shared context that was created where people have this common intention that they're there to learn, they're there to network. And then as I'm in that field, then I'm like roaming around in the hallways, having these unplanned serendipitous collisions in order to build relationships with the people that are there. Now, I'd say most virtual conferences, they think about what their conference is this first part, the talks. And most of them will just have like a Zoom call and they'll call it a day. This is a good translation of the entire conference. Let's just have the talks. And there's little to no consideration for the second part, which is the unplanned collisions to be able to actually build relationships. Number one, it's not put into the schedule. If anything, it's like, this is the networking time that would kind of happen as an afterthought. Just by the mere fact that people travel to these locations, that would happen like organically. But unless it's put into a virtual schedule, it doesn't happen. So like so many different virtual conferences that don't even have like an opening night party, which is infuriating to me, just because it's like there's so much about what it means to gather virtually that it is kind of left on the table with no real consideration for how to design for it. And what I would actually argue is that you almost have to design from the ground up for this, the unplanned serendipitous collisions. And I think Burning Man was able to do that. Or there's some sort of hybrid model that we haven't necessarily stumbled upon. My experience so far is that you really get one or the other. It's like, what is the intention? Are you going there to receive the talk, or are you going there to connect with people? And those are really actually completely different designs for how you actually facilitate that. So that's sort of my preliminary conclusion from looking at this. So we have the Zoom calls. We're all familiar with that. We're on one right now. So the hallway conversations, this is where you have these events like Oculus Connect, the previous Oculus Connect, where John Carmack would just be standing in the hallway, and people would just come up and he would just like talk nonstop for the entire time. And that's essentially what I do too. But I'm roaming around and I'm like doing interviews, and I'm taking those interviews and broadcasting them out. But what was interesting about the first Facebook Connect 1, which would have been Oculus Connect 7, is that there was literally no way for people to come together and connect aside from Oculus venues. But there was no other like opening night party, it was almost like no, like Oculus and Facebook, even though they have the most biggest company, they had like no consideration for trying to recreate this aspect of the experience. So here's me in the hallways doing my thing, doing these interviews. I did have a serendipitous hallway collision at the IEEE VR, and you can kind of take a look at how they essentially thought that what was going to be interesting is that people are going to go into these virtual spaces and watch the different talks. Now, each of these little bubbles are audio isolated, so you could go from one of them to the next. And so it functionally recreated this hallway. And so I went there and I ran into Anthony Steed, who's a professor, and he was going from one talk to the next. And just like any other sort of conference, I had my first like proper virtual hallway collision. The problem is that most virtual conferences, you can just teleport to where you want to go. And so there's no interstitial threshold spaces for you to navigate through. Although Verbella does have that, and I enjoyed that. But because it's virtual, you can just go straight to the destination. And if you think of your conference as the talks, then your destination is the talks. But if you think as the destination as the people, then that teleportation is actually like ruining all of the opportunity to actually connect with people endemically. So this teleportation aspects here, you can just sort of pop in between different places. And so locomotion is a big thing when it comes to virtual conferences. And within Verbella, it's actually interesting. There's another way for you to actually pick a person to go specifically to that person, which actually turned out to be a great experience for just being able to connect with people. This is also true within Altspace or VR chat. So if you see some of your friends online, you can go straight there. So functionally, that's able to kind of recreate that serendipitous collision. But you have to have a social network graph for a lot of these experiences in order to start to have that type of behavior. But I've started to see that type of collision actions when either going to or just going into an instance or a world where you know someone that you want to connect with. So Lara actually gave me this word of threshold spaces in architecture. It's like spaces in between, and I've been thinking about that a lot because the Verbella does a good job of allowing you to have a threshold space, and um, most of the people are in 2D and they're navigating on their computer and it's comfortable. But when you're in VR, it can actually be uncomfortable to locomote around. So it's actually like this paradox that if you're in VR, then it makes it difficult for you to move around, which then makes it difficult for you to kind of have this organic type of networking. There's lots of locomotion options to get around the motion sickness issue, but it is an issue that I found is that this kind of navigating around these threshold spaces. You kind of plopped into this space and you walk right into the conference hall there. So I want to just sort of point out the architecture of spawn points, because as you're building these virtual spaces, where you decide where to spawn people in will drive certain behavior. Here in Verbella, like people would spawn in and they would have to like figure out how to do the technology. And so I called this sort of like the spawn point of shame, because anybody who's standing here hasn't figured out their technology yet. And so they're all just kind of lined up, and it's like this weird, uncanny thing that never actually happens in reality. But depending on where you enter people into the experience can also dictate how things flow from there. And so I like to think about the permaculture zones as a metaphor. So, permaculture is that you have these different zones. And so zone 0 is the thing where you do the most type of activity. And as you go out, you have less frequent interactions. When you go out here into zone 5, it's like the total natural world. And so I like to think of the spawn points as just assume that people are not going to go anywhere. And if you have a bunch of people that spawn in, they'll often just kind of cluster there right at the spawn point. And if your spawn point is like right on top of the people that are there, then it becomes like this uncomfortable experience. Now, if we look at Verbella, this is like from one of the corners, and this is like you spawn in right here in the middle, and then you go straight into the conference. And what that means is that unless you want to go explore around, then uh, otherwise it's basically a ghost town for anything else other than here, because most people when they go in there, they just will just go straight into the conference talks. And so, what if you wanted to try to like have people hanging out, then you would put a spawn point that would be like in a place that would actually have people either there having conversations. I've found that it really takes like at least two people to seed a conversation. Otherwise, you just stand there alone waiting to talk to people, and no one wants to just like hang out in an empty room in a virtual world not doing anything. And so like the dynamics of what it takes to like get a like a group dynamics, it really needs to have people who are kind of moderating it and facilitating it and just being there and being available, which ended up being a lot of the sponsored type of rooms where people are kind of hanging out. But if the sponsor rooms are like way off on the other side, and people are spawning in and going straight into the talks, then you're not going to have any really good social dynamics there. So this was the real time conference that this was using high fidelity, and this was I think inspired by one of these that I did some experiments here, just trying to see out like what if you could sort of create these audio isolation zones, and then with these different topics, could you start to have people kind of organically clustered to these areas to have conversations that are around that topic. And so the real time conference took that concept and said, okay, if you create these little spaces with little tags, is it going to actually create a context enough for people to actually like go have conversations there? My experience is that no, that doesn't like really work that well. And why not? I think you really have to have a good invitation. And so birds of a feather, we're like, hey, we're going to meet here. We're going to talk about this topic. And, you have a buy-in for people. It's really hard to just, I think it is theoretically possible, but I think it needs to have some sort of invitation of like, this is a space where we're going to create spaces that are going to have symbolic representations for different topics, that if you want to talk about that topic, just go to that space. And what I found that happened at IEEE VR is that the spaces that had videos that were relative to people just going there and looking at the videos, that ended up being like a lure to draw people there. And then from there, then you start to have people kind of like the momentum grow for people to actually start to hang out there. This was actually an example where they're live streaming the main sessions into the hangout space, which actually really infuriated me, because it's like, if you're going to have like a hangout space, don't put the live talks there, because what ended up happening was that everyone would just go into the space and listen to the talks. And then you'd be like, if you talk to anybody, you're actually interrupting them. And so it's sort of like, it'd be the equivalent of going to a conference and then trying to talk to people in the hallway, but they were like broadcasting on a loudspeaker all the talks, because they're like, no, we really want you to hear the talks. We don't want you to like just connect to people. So again, I run into this time and time again where people just don't realize that you have to design for people connecting to each other. And they still kind of have this wanting people to not miss the content, which is the talks. So the Q&A after a talk, I think, is another big part of a conference gathering here, which is allowing people to ask questions, whether it's live or after someone talks, you sort of have the clustering of people. And I think this is one of the things that's probably the closest that I've seen to mimicking some of the conference behavior that I see. You give a talk, there's a bunch of people there, and the people come up and they want to talk to you. But unfortunately, a lot of these virtual spaces, even though they're virtual, they are using the same space. So then they end up kicking you out, where I would like to see like a little bit more imagination for instancing, to just let people kind of hang out there. Once you get this core group of people there, you've set a strong context for people to connect. And then all of a sudden you're just going to like kick them out and start the next session. So thinking about like how to have more space afterwards, or just allow people to kind of hang out and really have time to connect to the speakers there. The poster sessions were one of the really more compelling aspects of these conferences, where you have a poster, which is a context, and you have a student there just talking about the poster. You can go look at it and ask questions. And this was happening in IEEE and the Mozilla hubs, as well as in Verbella. And I found that this is some of the most interesting conversations, because it was very focused on topic. You could just dive straight in. It's like you're radiating all this information, that you have this deep context to be able to connect to people. So I like to think of the poster sessions as like radiating context, where for people to kind of go up there and have meaningful conversations, which is hard to do in just normally kind of running around these virtual spaces without any deeper context. You end up sort of talking about what I say is like the equivalent of the weather, which is your experiences of that particular VR medium. Like you're all in Verbella, and then you end up just talking about Verbella the entire time of the conference, because there's no hook or invitation for people to talk about something that's a little bit more focused. You're trying to get people who have common interests aligned with each other to be able to connect, to either share knowledge or to perhaps collaborate. But trying to really cultivate that type of interaction is difficult. All right. So the birds of a feather discussions were you set a time and place. So there was like an announcement on the Slack channel here for IEEE. There was a schedule online. You could submit them. This is people, they want to talk about time manipulation in VR, or privacy birds of a feather. And it's like very specific. One of the bigger ones was distributed user studies with COVID and beyond. So people whose entire lives is to do user studies for VR in the middle of a pandemic, how do you do that? And there was a lot of people like, all right, how do we navigate this? And so there's a lot of these sort of clusters of people who have a shared interest, a shared context, and a shared problem, and they just dive into really starting to solve it. So this type of meetup and this type of birds of a feather is actually like one of the more compelling things for what the VR medium is really able to do. And then the birds of feather declaration. This person like just put a post-it note saying, ProTube, if you need any help about this, then just talk to me about this. So he's in this audio isolation bubble, and he's just saying, hey, anybody who wants to come talk to me about ProTube, I'm here. And he was able to just get people there talking about it. So they didn't have any expo here for Lavar Virtual, which meant that he ended up creating his own expo just with a post-it note. And there's another person here from Indie Clip that did the same thing on the beach. He was just like, hey, if you want to talk about this topic. And so I talked to him a little bit there. But that's, just recognizing like this is all it takes sometimes, is to strike up a more deep, meaningful conversation, is just like put a note, hey, I want to talk about this. And you just stand there and wait for people to come up to you. Similar to the poster sessions, but this was just him standing out. And, because it's Verbella, he's on his computer and he's not like giving it his full attention. If you're in VR, that's a whole other thing. You don't really want to just hang out in an empty room with nothing going on. And so having some way to kind of ping you to be able to then engage deeper into a conversation. So audio isolation bubbles I found were quite interesting within uh, Verbella. This is the first time that I really saw that the sound propagation having some sort of architectural representation within that room. Normally, you don't know how the sound propagates, and so you're just talking, but you don't know if you're interrupting other people. And so, uh, but at the same time, you could be in a room with 100 people and they're all in audio isolation bubbles, and you can't hear anything, which is also another level of uncanniness. And so it's like trying to strike a balance of having good audio fall off built in with the technology itself so that you can have comfortable spacing. And some of this is just media literacy for people understanding that. Like, 5 years from now, we won't have to like have this type of architectural representation. It'll just kind of be intuitive or people can figure it out. Like people who are power users of VR chat, they don't need that type of like architectural reflection of how the sound propagates. But for people who are new, this can be helpful. But I also found that people don't understand it, and you'll be trying to have a conversation, and someone will just come up right next to you and start having conversation, and then you'll have to end up moving. So there ended up being like one conversation for this audio isolation bubble. This is before they actually implemented their spatialization for their audio, but this was like totally like you couldn't talk to anybody because it was essentially like you heard everybody equally, like 100 people. And it was like one of those early days of VR experiences that I'll always remember of just like, okay, that was terrible. But in audio, like later in the week when there was less people, then people organically clustered around the audio isolation boundaries. So again, just trying to find within like high fidelity, these circles, like if you stood in the circle, the center of the circle, then if you were getting on the outside, then you'd be able to kind of listen in. And so you could sort of go between these different circles and kind of pop into different conversations. And so, I was trying to create this like context for lurking, like if you want to speak, stand in the center, but if you want to kind of come in and lurk, then you're free to kind of come in and listen. And I think just labeling that gives people permission to not feel like they're eavesdropping or violating some sort of social norm. But I think that type of lurking happens organically in 2D websites, but it's harder to kind of figure out within the spatial because we just have our social etiquette. We don't like to just kind of like eavesdrop in that way. But if you label it, and then I think I would just love to cultivate this type of what in the unconference scene calls the law of 2 feet, where if you don't like something, you just sort of leave and people aren't offended. And so how do you create that dynamic where people can kind of pop in and out? I think there's apps like Clubhouse that start to do that, where you kind of pop in and out, and it's like not disruptive to the overall flow of a conversation. But turn taking is a big issue. Like, how do you get balanced conversations? It's a bit of an open question because you can have people that really dominate the conversation. And the last thing I just say here is the role of culture at Burning Man. I did a whole episode here, 960, where Burning Man was one of those conferences that was designed from the bottom up just to be able to cultivate this type of serendipitous collision. And they had a bunch of worlds that were created. And it was more about world hopping and exploring and going on this adventure rather than sort of going into a, I'd say, agnostic architecture that was uninspired and kind of could be used for any context. So being able to create architecture that's very specific to the topic that you're talking about, for one, but also for in the case of Burning Man, have a shared set of values, these 10 principles that are embedded into every level of everything that was being created, and with a shared sort of toolkit that created this common aesthetic across over 200 worlds that had this persistence. So you felt like you were in this vast world of going from world to world, which I think is probably one of the more unique experiences when it comes to like virtual conferences or even for VR chat, because normally when people build their worlds, they don't have like a consistent aesthetic. And so just having common design elements of like a toolkit that has like one texture mapping that to be able to have an optimized experience, and having a bunch of people create something ended up being really quite compelling. And I would like to see more folks as moving forward start to adopt this type of on-conference. So anyway, that was just some ad hoc thoughts, and I'll sort of pause here if people want to take any questions. so far.
Perfect. Thank you, Kent. I think we can then start moving over to the questions, which I'm pretty sure the students have plenty of. So yeah, maybe if you guys want to start, Joy, if you want to begin.
I was hi, I'm Ida, fourth year student of diplomacy. From the presentation, you mentioned about the emergent context, like the people posting something on the papers, and he cannot wait for the other people and the interaction. The mechanism, to me, it looks like the people they're posting something on their social media and waiting for like the comment from any other people. And if the number of people using the virtual world does not outnumber the number of the people using the social media, then what would be the advantage of?
Well, I think this as people go to these conferences, if they want to have these collisions, where I could define a collision as you have an intention, you match up with somebody else who has an intention, and you're able together to like collaborate to achieve each other's intentions in a way that you're either able to do an exchange of knowledge, or you're able to like, you know, you're trying to get a service and someone's trying to sell a service. And so whatever that ends up being, there's like a melding of an intentional field for each person. And so like how you actually coordinate that, I think is a huge open question. I mean, it's like already difficult to do that in reality. And so you have like expo halls, you have all these things that you have a talk, and then at that talk, people are interested in, because you're at that talk together, then that creates like a shared context that then you're able to start to connect to people. But I just started to see people like declare their context of like, this is what I'm interested in doing. Or the poster sessions were sort of creating that context. And so, you know, my question was like, could you design a space that had embedded into it the space that was clear what the context was and what those functions are? So like really listening to like what those people of that gathering want to do. Do they want to like exchange knowledge? Do they want to like play games? Do they want to like tell stories? You know, whatever that is, like having a space that has those different modalities that are able to allow people to go there. And there's, I think the key thing, if you read The Art of the Gathering, is the invitation. The invitation is everything, because the invitation sets the intentional field that then sets the course of what's happening. So if you say on your social media, hey, I'm going to be hanging out here from this time to this time, that is like an invitation for people. Or if you say to people individually, hey, meet up with me at this time, or just meet up with me if we run into each other after the event or whatever. You know, there's all sorts of ways that you could give an invitation, but giving a proper invitation and setting that sets like people to be at a specific time and place with a shared context and a shared intention for them to be able to collide with each other. And how to architect that is, I'd say, probably one of the biggest open questions of all of this. I mean, for any gathering, but especially for conferences, which is all about like the sharing and exchange of information.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Guys, just go ahead and unmute yourselves and ask. Just shoot.
I will ask a question. So I am sort of, for my like individual work, interested in how accreditation of both content and people or like entities happens across different platforms. And there's this question of like, what role does immediacy have in like the satisfaction or like the value of the exchange? Because like in many, so for example, I'm looking at like a process of accreditation that happens in academia, like a PhD defense, where there are years and years and years of building up this content that in one moment you present, and there's a very different type of satisfaction than the sort of like peer accreditation that can happen very quickly on virtual platforms. And so like what the role or meaning of immediacy is, because I think that's both the beauty, but also like the double-edged sword of virtual environments, is that there's this expectation of immediacy all the time. And so how does that like diminish or create value in interactions, I guess.
Yeah, the way I think about this question is through the lens of Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy. And so he tended to look at things in terms of these processes that are unfolding, which is a different metaphysics than, say, Western philosophy, which is based upon substance, which are these static fixed objects. So from Whitehead's perspective, the world is all about dynamic flux that's constantly changing and unfolding. And he has this concept of concrescence, which is like the building up to a culmination of a point. And it's like the completion of something or the peak of an experience, you know, like when you're delivering something and making it public for the first time, there's a bit of a concrescence of that. Like this talk right now was a concrescence of me staying up all night to sort of build up all of this information. And you know, you as students, you're building this report, and that's, you know, it's still gestating. You're in the cauldron. It's like you're stirring the pot and it's not quite ready to be put out into the world. And so for me, that immediacy happens when it sort of culminates into this point where it's sort of complete, or it's run its course. And so sometimes it's like riding a wave and surfing, you know, it's like, how do you ride the wave? How do you align your personal intention and your journey as an individual into the collective zeitgeist of whatever is unfolding in the collective psyche? And that is the process of what it means to be an artist, is to like be aligned with your expression of whatever you want to put out into the world and catch the wave and sort of go viral. And, you know, that I think all of those dynamics are so ephemeral, and we don't have a formula for it. It's basically a lot of intuition and a lot of timing and a lot of luck, but also just getting into that flow state of following your daimon and sort of listening and paying attention and getting different feedback. And if it's not working, then how do you adjust? And so all these things are what I would do when I would go to a conference and do interviews. I would just roam around trying to cultivate my own sense of intuition until I sort of ran into the story that wanted to emerge in that moment, with me being fully present to that. And I think that's the challenge with so much of the virtual conferences being pre-scheduled and pre-planned, and everything happens at this time. It's like, well, what if that's not the time it's supposed to happen? What if it's supposed to happen whenever it happens? And I think that's the type of planned versus unplanned, scheduled, unscheduled, serendipitous versus sort of like on someone's calendar. You know, it's sort of, sometimes you have the best interactions that were totally unplanned. And sometimes you're able to make a schedule and everyone shows up, and it's like way more efficient than, you know, having to sort of roam around without that type of, you know, dedicating yourself to that finding of that, you know, that moment. So that's how at least I think about it. And it's going to be, again, I don't think there's any formula, but I think it's just like an artistic process and an intuition. And there could be also design elements from an architectural perspective to be able to help cultivate that concrescence. So,
yeah, hi, I'm Vivi. So regarding the planned and unplanned connections, sort of what I'm looking at within my individual project is like the gathering type that has schedule and like time as part of it at a core. And I was wondering if you think that the sort of like teleporting and sort of, yeah, planned sort of events, they lower the quality of the world. And how do you think I can incorporate sort of spontaneity into those planned connections in order to like help enhance it?
yeah, this is the dilemma, because I think it's like, in order to have those spontaneous connections, you need to have people who are committed to being present and available and open for that connection. And so then it becomes a challenge of how do you create an invitation for people to have an ambiguous expectation for what's going to happen, and for them to be open to whatever does happen. And I think that happens organically at conferences. Like people go there and they just don't even go to any sessions because they're just open to the connections that are happening, and they're so rich and vibrant. But that doesn't happen organically at virtual conferences. You almost like have to 100% dedicate yourself to not going to any sessions and just be roaming around, spending 75% of your time having no interaction at all until you find some some interaction. And it's not nearly as a similar type of ratio, like a signal to noise ratio that I would do. Like I could go to a conference and not go to any sessions and have like 30 interviews with people. So create my own conference, but I literally cannot do that because people are not committed to the experience in the same way, because the virtual conference is all about, oh, I'm going to pop in and I'm going to pop out. There's something about like the ritual of dedicating yourself to being fully present that, you know, if you think about Burning Man, people would dedicate themselves to be fully present to that experience. So I think that's part of why the Burning Man VR experience was much more interesting to me, because people were already like experienced with what it means to kind of like go explore the playa. And then they would have other people that were exploring that area. So I think it's like having interesting things to go see and do. And you end up just trying to find ways that people can like meet up with each other. Either that's like building up your social graph so that you deliberately go to find those people, or you have these spaces that people have to go through and they have to actually locomote through in order to like run into each other. So kind of funneling people into that space to be able to really encourage that. That's like what Tony Hsieh did with his Zappos, was to have one entrance where all of the employees could only enter into the entire complex through one door, because they wanted to have that opportunity for that collision. So thinking about that, how do you funnel people to start to have that type of thing, and especially virtually when you can teleport and you don't need to locomote around, it becomes extra hard. So then you have to think about, well, what is the invitation for people to go hang out in a space and to have something to do primarily that's interesting, so that if no one shows up, they're not bored. But then if people do show up, then they know to sort of prioritize connecting with people. And I haven't seen a lot of spaces that are able to give that invitation, design for that, and have that type of behavior. Except for Burning Man. Burning Man was the only one I've seen so far that was able to do that.
Kent, I'm going to bring in a question from Twitch. And also I wanted to ask you, this was the first part of the lecture and then you're planning to continue? Or
yeah, I have a lot more. So I should probably take this question and continue.
I will bring this one and then you carry on. So a question from Max Sellar from Twitch, where he's asking if maybe spaces should be non-Euclidean and assembled parametrically, so that the threshold spaces in between event spaces could, if I understand correctly, could be governed by force fields of interest and basically mutate according to the crowds, as opposed to be so static as physical worlds are.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Try it out. I have no idea. I mean, I have the only space I've been that's non-Euclidean was a hyperbolic space that was in WebXR. And I've seen ones, but I haven't really spent a lot of time in them. And, you know, you have to just try it out, because the challenge I find is that, like, when I walk around a hyperbolic space, it's like you have an experience of turning, but it's basically like, you know, redirected walking, where you're having these subtle shifts, but you perceive it as a space, like your perception is still collapsing it into a Euclidean understanding. I haven't seen a lot of really good experiments there to see these types of non-Euclidean spaces, and what is the outcome of that. I think it's an open question that needs a lot more experimentation. I don't necessarily know. I expect that it's going to be more of an embodied experience than a social and mental experience.
Well, I think the notion of non-Euclidean now is being used more as to define not so much mathematical non-Euclidean geometry, but more just portals and all these impossible spaces that wrap into each themselves and so on. Anyhow, maybe if you want to continue with the second.
Yeah, let's continue, because I have a lot more. I want to sort of dive into the juicy parts here.
Please,
so, okay, here we go. This is my brief response to the civic program, as well as sort of my experiential design. So, all right. So here at this is actually a very impressive, ambitious project here, talking about what are virtual gatherings, what are they like, how do virtual gatherings work, what's a good virtual gathering, and what will be virtual gatherings like. I think that might be a typo. So as I watched the presentations here, the thing that I was immediately struck by was that the feedback was a bit of like, as a designer, I want to see equivalence classes. I want to see choices and decisions that are being made, so that there's inherent trade-offs between the things that are listed. And the overall feedback that I have is a lot of these things, in my mind, are sort of different equivalence classes that are kind of spread out So and I understand this sort of broke up into the different teams, and sort of this will be sort of something to kind of figure out if there's more of a restructuring, or if you just kind of go with it, because Gödel had this incompleteness theorem, which was essentially like any sort of coherent system is going to be one of two things. It's going to be consistent or complete, but you can't be both. So I have my own sort of consistent system that, or my complete system that has its inconsistencies. And this is a complete system that has its own inconsistencies. And so I'm going to be basically pointing out some of the ways that I'm going to map how I see things to be coherent through my lens. But at the end of the day, you'll still have to decide how to sort of structure this. So I'll sort of expand on what I mean here. So, okay, so gatherings can be said to occur within the exchange of time, presence, and knowledge within the same space. So I would take, I would object to this knowledge, because there are a lot of reasons why people gather, for emotions, for activities, for character development, for, shared intentional fields, for, funerals. I mean, there's so many different things, and I'll be going into some of those here, but I wouldn't necessarily pin it all onto knowledge. And so what broad virtual categories are there? So here you have the forms of gathering and then the types of gathering. So the forms of gathering, I would sort of characterize as sort of qualities of presence, as the inherent to the endemic to the medium itself. And then the types of gatherings, you're starting to get into context. And each of these sections have their own way of kind of addressing the context issue. But before I dive into that, I'm going to dive into the medium aspect here. So what is a communications medium? What are we talking about here? So for me, Misch has basically a definition. He's a French media theorist who says that there's addition and distribution. So the addition is the new technology and the makers who are exploring the affordance of, these are the artists and the creators who are taking whatever technology's there and they're making art with it. But then you have to have people see the art in order for it to be a medium. So you have to have some sort of distribution channel for people to see that work. And then the audience watches the work. And then you have this feedback loop cycle that I would argue kind of creates the essence of the communications medium. The technology enables people to make stuff, that stuff gets delivered and distributed to folks in some fashion, and then people watch that work. Okay, so for me, I break up the dimensions of experience into these 4 equivalence classes: the quality, context, character, and story. So I'm going to start with the quality. So the quality is the sense of active presence, mental and social presence, embodied and environmental presence, and emotional presence. And so if we start to look at this through the lens of, say, a communications medium, we can kind of look at, from the metaphorically, how there's like video games, and with video games, you're expressing your will, you're taking action, you're locomoting, you're moving, you're asking questions, you're interrogating, you're testing. So that's like a video game. That's the active presence. Then there's the mental and social presence. That's like a computer where the World Wide Web and the user interface affordances, and having a coherent picture in your mind that is forming a mental model of the world. And that mental model is either matching with your expectations or not. If it is matching your expectations, then you can start to suspend your disbelief and you start to really believe that it's plausible and it's real. And you have telephones to be able to kind of like metaphorically communicate with people. So there's a social dimension of connectedness and using language and abstractions of language through like literature and books. So the mental and social presence are all the ways that we use language and symbolic communication to be able to communicate ourselves and have a dimension of talking and connecting and collaborating with other people. And it's really kind of activating your mind in that sense. So that's the mental and social presence. And then moving on to the emotional presence, we have film. So film is essentially a time-based medium that is building up and releasing tension. It's these consonance and dissonance cycles that give you this sense of a story, and that story moves your emotions. And with that, you have sound and like the soundtrack that's able to really, feed into that as well. And then finally, we move into this embodied presence. This is the virtual and augmented reality that is hacking each of your 5 senses, really just your sight and your hearing and your touch, and eventually your taste and your smell. But it's ways to use theater and architecture to create this sense of embodied and environmental presence. It's the use of dance and contemplative meditative practices, and really focusing on your body as, making you feel like you actually have an embodied presence within the experience. So each of these have inherent trade-offs. If you have more agency, then you have less people that are able to, listen to the story. And so I like to kind of, at a high level, think about it in terms of like intuition, thinking, feeling, sensing. This is the Jungian interpretation of the elements, or it's making choices and taking action with a sense of emotional immersion and a sense of a sensory experience. But you can also think of it as the yang and the yin, the yang being like the expression of energy outward and the yin being the receptive of that energy. So you have the ways in which the energy is going outward and the ways that you're receiving that energy. So the yang and the yin, I think, are good metaphors to think about this as well. So it's either going outward and inward. You're either giving or receiving. You're either talking or listening. And the yang and yin, I think, is really important because, again, with the Chinese philosophy and Alfred North Whitehead, you have this dialectical process where you have each of these things are actually happening at the same time, but there's a center of gravity of one or the other. So like the summer solstice is the most yang sunlight of the day. The winter solstice is the most yin. The equinoxes of both the spring and the fall are like where there's points of balance. So that's, just like in Chinese philosophy and process philosophy, you have the combination of these things that are constantly moving and in flux. And it's not like one complete thing or another. And so just the same, all of these different levels of presence are always happening all at the same time, always. And the role of experiential designers and people who are making architecture in this sense are modulating these different things. So you have a little bit more of active presence, a little bit more of embodied environmental presence, a little bit more of emotional presence, and a little bit more mental social presence. And the games that really hit each of these levels are the things that are really kind of the big hits when it comes to VR. I think Half-Life Alyx does a great job of having a good balance of this. You have Beat Sabers and Experience that I think inherently has a good balance of these things, but you don't have to have like a good balance. Sometimes you could just like have a total deep dive into like mental and social presence, where it's like a puzzle game. Like Tetris is a good example where you're not like, you don't have an embodiment. You're just sort of like really solving puzzles. So if you look at the elements, you have this dialectic between hot and cold, wet and dry. And so I think this is the key part of this type of dialectic, is that you have these polar extremes. And it's like this qualitative spectrum where it's falling somewhere in between there. And so, Aristotle and, the other philosophers before then had assigned these different 4 different qualities. So fire is both dry and hot, earth is both dry and cold, water is cold and wet, and air is hot and wet. So we can kind of see this as a spectrum where the sort of metaphoric hot stuff is more things that are kind of rising upwards, and the cooler is sort of more settled. And the dry is, you can think of wet as being bonding and connective and somewhat of a social sense. And maybe the dry is a little bit more an individual experience. So your own personal sense of agency, your own personal sense of your embodiment. So if you kind of map these over, you kind of see these different, center of gravities for each of these mediums. So again, the active presence, mental and social presence, embodied presence, with environmental presence and emotional presence. So when I walk through some of the things that you were showing here, I see things here like these 4 questions, like who are you, how do you feel, where do you belong, and what can you do? Well, for me, from my sense, how do you feel is all about this emotional presence, and what you can do is all about this active presence. But these things are actually not really in the same equivalence class, or something that's like completely different in my mind, at least. And I'll sort of explain how I make sense of it in terms of context. And so when you look at this time, presence, and knowledge, I would actually replace this knowledge with more of a active presence, mental and social presence, embodied and environmental presence, emotional presence, because I think there is a center of gravity where you can have some or all combinations here, but just focusing on knowledge is like saying, oh, the only thing you can do is sort of be stuck in the mental and social presence realm. And that's the only thing that's why we gather. And that's the only reason why we gather, which I don't think is correct. All right, so let's move on to the next area, which is the context. So the context is here you start to see the types of gatherings like gaming and knowledge transfer. And some of these other things are actually more to do with the medium themselves rather than what I would say is the actual endemic aspect of the context of gathering. This is like a nice map that sort of maps all these different types of contexts. But again, you're sort of adding stuff that I would say is more endemic to the medium, like audio, visual, and text chat. That's for me more of the in spatial presence. For me, again, that's sort of different than the context. And so it's sort of like fusing these things together. You can still do any of these things, but I think for me, I think there's sort of a conflation of these things. This is another example from Ryan Schultz, who he tried to look at all these different, social VR platforms and see, these different contexts, art consumption, education, business, live events, performance, general purpose. And as I went through your talk, you have different ways of kind of separating out of the context. So because you have government, professions, individual, and minority, you start to sort of break these out into, okay, well, given this perspective, given this context, this is, what they're interested in. Given this context, this is what they're interested in. But these are only like 4 contexts when I would say there's a lot more of these contexts. Here's another example where there's lots of different contexts when you're making these predictions that kind of like fit into lots of different buckets of context. So for me, this is sort of the mapping that I've been using is like domains of human experience into these different contexts of embodiment and virtual goods and resources, early education, communication, home and family, entertainment, medicine, partners, death, higher education, travel, spirituality, career, friends and community, isolation, and mobility. So this was originated from when I was asked people like, what is the ultimate potential of VR? I would get answers that would fall into one of these buckets. Like it'd be all about the future of medicine, the future of entertainment, the future of education, future of the expression of your identity, hanging out with friends. Each of these sort of would come up when I would ask that question. And what I realized is that when I ask that question, it's really like, what context is the most important for the person that I'm talking to? Sometimes I'll talk to people where they'll cover all the context, but normally people will they'll just like pick a context and be like, well, let's just focus on medicine because that's what I do. Or, you can kind of sort of see where that goes. So I'm just going to sort of go through here and say, well, if you're going to have a gathering that would sort of be an archetypal representation for each of these, you could have like a fashion show that would be the expression of your identity. And this was in VR chat. Or you could have a merchandise store in a Roblox concert where there was the Little Nas X and there's all these things you can buy here. You're able to like have an exchange of value and resources and actually buying something. And so a lot of this gathering, there's a music performance, but it's also about like being able to buy merchandise that's only available through this one event. And then you have early education. So you have people who are young and in a group together. And so there's a whole experience of what's it mean to gather for people doing primary K through 12 education, which I say is different than higher education. And then you have families who are coming together. So extended families celebrating birthdays. And so what's it mean to like gather with your family virtually, either through a Zoom call or other sort of virtual worlds as well. But I think your connection to your family is going to be a very unique context. And so you can design worlds just for that. So here we have like entertainment and music, and there's a virtual concert in Fortnite is an example there. But there's lots of things with Wave XR, all sorts of VR chat, and all sorts of even Burning Man would be a good example of some of these more entertainment and art experiences. Then you have telemedicine, and so ways that you're gathering remotely through either your doctor or gatherings to be able to, if people are sick in the hospital, how you start to have remote connections and gather there with people who, can't physically be with each other. So what are the different ways of doing telemedicine and connecting remotely to people who are in the hospital? So going on virtual dates, what's it mean to have romantic explorations? I think that's with a context within its own. I don't think we've seen a lot of this type of like, hey, go with your partner on a date, because I think probably most people are single, or, there just hasn't been a strong emphasis of having like a romantic world that people really designed for couples to go experience. And I think that's a ripe area for people to explore. What's it mean to have virtual experiences for couples? There's the virtual Dia de los Muertos, so the Day of the Dead. There's the Smithsonian Latino Center, which doesn't actually have a physical location here in the United States, which meant that they've had to, for years and years and years, hold virtual events. And so having a Day of the Dead where they're able to honor those who have passed. And so having these virtual memorials within the virtual spaces. So higher education and training, these conference type of environments where you're able to just get and learn a lot of information. This is where I spend a lot of my time in the virtual events, but we sort of talked about that before. You have workplace telepresence. So this is a little prototype from Cloudhead Games where they're starting to work with what's it mean to sort of blend using these sort of webcams with sort of virtual embodiments with spatialized audio and start to try to recreate aspects of like workplace telepresence. You have like hanging out with your friends, and then you have like combating isolation. So the domains of human experience for virtual reality, because here we see we've kind of gone through each of these different contexts. And so as I look at your talk, I see each of your different sections kind of sprinkle in a little bit of context, but the context mixed with a little bit of the presence, mixed with a little bit of something else. And for me, I think there's very clear sort of equivalence classes here. You can look at something like ethics and XR Ethics Manifesto, where I started to kind of map out all the ethical and moral dilemmas through this lens of context. And there's a whole talk on that I gave. You can go look at the thread of the talks I gave, the XR Ethics Manifesto, that sort of there's an hour-long talk I gave at AWE that goes into that, and then a half-hour XR Ethics Manifesto. But overall, you have this dialectic between the self and other, and then private, and then public. And so as I've been giving these talks, you can sort of see everything that's below here is sort of like a private context, and everything above sort of is a little bit more of the public context. And I give a talk about like the different higher education when it comes to how is that higher education, how is this playing out with these different into these different contexts. And first of all, I did a little bit of crossing the chasm in the mainstream. So you have the innovators and early adopters and the early majority and the late majority and laggards. And so it's basically how I have this, like the people who are really pioneering in the XR and already adopting it, and the people who are a little bit more in the early majority and then the late majority and laggards. And so when I start to map this out, we can start to see a little bit of the trends here, where we see, architecture is here. We have education and communications. We have a lot of art. Probably the most robust and most fully formed here are all the art disciplines that have been doing lots of great work. And then health and medical services here, lots of different stuff here that is happening, and then sort of the higher education, but stuff here in these other areas that are still nascent. And then, some stuff like morticians and other stuff that, don't necessarily show up in the top of some of these degrees that people are getting. So if I were I went through and started to like at least start to break up, like how would I map out some of these things? So, gaming here, privacy, telepresence, communications, the sort of resources, money, the commodification and surveillance in terms of identity, self, biometric data. Who are you? Your identity, you as an individual, aspects that are hidden, exiled, things, the enslavement by multiple devices, or these invisible barriers that are controlling us, or like these invisible prisons that we're in. Our friends, our community, our collective culture. So where do you belong, your connections, your equality, minority group, government institutions, but it's also your career. So how you're seen publicly, your reputation, so your professionals in the government. And then you have the ideology and the knowledge here. And, not as much here, nothing at all about medical information. And so there's some gaps here as well as education. There wasn't as much stuff about either early education or higher education, which I think is an important context to sort of call out. And just more generally stuff here in entertainment and hobbies and sex. So, what is the context of sex and porn as well? So, so that's just sort of like an overview here. And I'm going to quickly go through like, I've done all these interviews about the ultimate potential of VR. And I'm just going to like walk through and kind of flesh out what I see different aspects. And I think as I listened to a lot of the discussions that happened, there were things that were being brought up by the people who were commenting that weren't necessarily included that I'll try to sort of integrate here. Again, it's not going to be completely complete, but I think it's for me trying to map out both the ultimate potential, some of the ethical issues, and trying to come up with some sort of framework around context. So, okay, self biometric identity. So the first one here. So expression of identity. So you have avatar and avatar representations of your sense of self. You have biometric data, so ways in which that you have information from your body that's radiating outwards that's going to be integrated into the technology. You have the concept of consciousness hacking, so be able to like pay attention to that biofeedback and be able to actually change your consciousness by virtual reality experiences. So you have these biofeedback sensory immersion vessels that are going to happen that is using all that information that's coming from your body. You have brain controlled interfaces and neural inputs, and also haptic devices that I would throw in there as well. You have sensory substitution. So this concept that you could actually substitute existing senses. So you could put this vest on from Neosensory and send signals into your brain so that you could actually turn your torso into an ear. So being able to replace your hearing by turning haptic devices that are getting the same signal into your brain that's able to interpret it as some sort of like sense of hearing. There's also sensory addition. So being able to add completely new senses into your body. And then your sense of self-sovereign identity, some sort of identity that you have control over at different gradual levels, and then the fashion show. So, okay, next one, resources, money, and values. And so this is like all the ways that you have money and resources. And so there's going to be different dynamics of the yin and yang currency. So just walled garden, competition, all this app store ecosystem. And then there's like the more yin open source ecosystem, no gatekeepers. And so this is sort of like the open WebXR, OpenXR, all these open standards, open access. And so a lot of stuff that's happening in Mozilla Hubs kind of fits into the more of the yin currency here. But then there's surveillance capitalism, which is a huge issue with how the underlying economics is being driven by our data. The virtual gift economy, so something like Anyland being able to exchange these gifts with people. You have crypto voxels, so starting to have the exchange of value of this crypto art, or even other things like Decentraland and other crypto-based like Somnium Space. Then you have the merch store that I talked about earlier, and then we need to own our own data. So what's it mean to be able to own our data and be compensated for it? And then you have like the hyper reality risks from Keiichi Matsuda, where we live in a world that is just completely commodified and commercialized. Okay, so early education, communication. This is all the ways that we have kids, early primary education, the early education that's happening in Minecraft. You have memory palaces, you have the sense of telepresence, being able to communicate with each other with these shared spaces. You have data visualization, so being able to use the abstractions of space to be able to communicate through data visualizations. You have spatial language, and so what kind of like either dance or embodiment or ways to use the spatial medium of VR to be able to actually cultivate new languages itself. Natural language processing, so being able to speak and then have the AI be able to interpret that. You have metaphoric communication, and so using symbols to be able to do this kind of dream logic communication. And then you have like spatialized emojis, so being able to do emojis and other visual communication that's having these different levels of translation into these virtual experiences. And then there's also just the distraction as you're walking around locomoting, and the risks that happen as you're kind of running around, not really paying attention to your local environment. All right, so the home, family, and private property. So this is your home and family. You have the volumetric memories, so being able to capture your home, spatial mapping and computer vision of the world around you. You have the different aspects of architecture, which is the primary spaces that you're going to be navigating in. You have the science fiction and world building, and then entertainment, hobbies, and sex. You have entertainment. You have immersive storytelling. You have the holodeck. You have different flow states that you're getting into. You have creativity and art. And of course, I didn't have any pictures there, but there's obviously other aspects of pornography as well. Medical health, so medicine, the concept of neuroplasticity, so sort of the pliability of your brain, ownership of your own health, telemedicine, healing trauma, and Walter Greenleaf has all these different areas of where medicine's going to be taking off. Then others, partnerships, so this is anything, so other partnerships is a little counterintuitive because this is yourself and this is the other. So the other could be someone who you're in relationship with, and it could also be people who are adversaries. So you're like enemies. So this is like virtual harassment. How do you deal with people who are harassing you? The virtual being influencers who are trying to influence you in different ways. You have deep fakes who are trying to like steal your identity, trying to empathize into other people's perspectives. You have going onto virtual dates. And then collective resources and death. You have different virtual violence that you have within these virtual experiences. So actually like murdering people. You have image rights after your death. So after you die, who has the rights to your image and what can you do with that virtually? You have the mother who's like trying to recreate her deceased child in VR. You have Zoom funerals. And so starting to do these funerals online in Zoom. You have grief rituals like homestay to kind of deal and cope with dealing with the aftermath of suicide. And you have the Day of the Dead, the Dia de los Muertos from the Smithsonian. And then you have bans and suspensions. And so ways that your account is either terminated or suspended for bad behavior. And so how do you actually implement ways of sort of notifying and banning and creating a safe space, be able to, keep people from harassing other folks. So, okay, philosophy, higher education, law. So these are all the different sort of abstractions of higher education, all this sort of models of reality. So breaking down the academic silos is one big thing that VR is doing. You have the process of skill acquisition, higher education and conferences. You have being able to comprehend different aspects of complexity. You have capturing deep patterns with AI. So sort of seeing data science as this form of machinic Neoplatonism. So trying to figure out all the underlying patterns of reality. And then virtual travel, and then wonder and awe. And then government institutions and your career. So this is all the ways that you're sort of professionally using it, but also the government. So you have like workplace telepresence, you have virtual screens for productivity, and you have the professional use cases for VR. And then friends, community, the collective culture, you have different aspects of hanging out with a community, you have hanging out with your friends, you have the algorithmic bias. And so what are the ways in which that the different algorithms that you're having is encoding different ways of balance, of bias. And so having a really representative samples there, but also recognizing that there's always going to be some degree of bias, and how do you counteract that? And then implicit social scores. And so being able to mediate different levels of trust that you have. So there's China has their social score system, but VRChat has their own sort of silent one that is keeping track of people's trust to be able to help create a safe online space. And then finally, the hidden, exiled, accessibility. You have different ways of combating isolation. So people who are elders and not really have access to other people, or they're in a state of dementia or neurodegenerative diseases, or you have people who are rehabilitating in prison. You have people who have accessibility issues, and so how the technology is able to give them more access. So again, just sort of that I think hopefully gives you a good sense of the context and all the different domains. And that's at least how I have been starting to think about it. And just this is the framework I use. You don't have to use it. You can use whatever you want to use, but that's just a sort of an example for how each of these different groups are kind of dipping into the context without really knowing that they're dipping into the context. Okay, so that's a quality context, and I have two more here. This should be character and story. So what is a good virtual gathering? I think this is sort of like an essence of like, okay, how do you determine what is good? I think there's a couple of answers there. One is that it's the character, and one is the story. So the character, there's this quote from Margaret McKee who says, "True character is revealed in the choices a human being makes under pressure. The greater the pressure, the deeper the revelation, the truer the choice to the character's essential nature." So when you're in these environments and you're forced to be able to make choices and there's pressure, then there's parts of yourself where your character is revealed. And so maybe some of the aspect of gathering is that it's not only revealing your character, but it's revealing the character of other people. And when you're in relationship to other people, then you have, just through that interactions, you're able to discover things about yourself and discover things about other people that are essential to their nature. So you have a protagonist placed within a context, but has pressure. So we talked about all the context. You have them making choices, taking action, and then there's some sort of aspect of the character that is revealed. And so you can think about character through the lens of Jungian psychology, of the conscious and the unconscious, the inner and outer world. You can think of it in terms of moral virtue of that character. You can think of it as a virtue continuum. You could look at like Westworld having these different aspects of character. You can have temperament as a form of character. You could have the 5 different personality types. Your feelings and your needs could be another way of the motivations and the needs and the desires. And so what are the needs and the desires of people? That's, meeting the feelings and the needs, I think, is a good way. That's probably the most universal. Like if you're able to meet the needs of the people, then that's a good gathering. Or if you're able to meet the feelings, then that's a good gathering. And so this is from the nonviolent communication, and this is sort of another way of mapping out different emotions. So yeah, maybe the answer to the answer for what is a good gathering is that it's creating these contexts and these situations with these different situations where you're able to go around and make these choices and take action. And through that interaction, you have aspects of either your character revealed or other people's character revealed. Okay, so finally, the story. So what makes a good virtual gathering? Again, it could be some sort of like hero's journey. It could be some sort of adventure that you want to like go on, some sort of story that is unfolding where you're in some sort of mundane state. You go into some sort of ordeal and you come back and you've resolved it. I think looking at through a narrative psychology, narrative lens, and whatever that ends up being, the building and releasing of that tension, I think is what makes a good gathering. And whether that's a story, whether that's sort of mental friction or embodied friction or playing a game, there's lots of ways to sort of build and release that tension and tell that story. Dan Harmon has his own way of mapping out the stories. You have the story authorship if it's an authored narrative or generative narrative. You have different, branching, interactive storytelling spectrum where you have like 3-act structure and fully interactive stories. You have traditional story where things kind of converge. You have branching path stories. You have the interactive drama manager and open-ended stories, and then a fully player-driven story. So there's lots of, and I've talked about this in other places, so apologies if I'm sort of skipping through it, but the idea is that there's lots of different narrative structures that on one end, you have no agency, and the other end, it's like a completely open world, game world that you're exploring a probability space. And there's lots of different ways to kind of like structure the story if it's a linear or more interactive. And you can kind of think of your experience as where at do you want to have people fall on the spectrum? Is this a very curated and authored experience in a gathering that has a very clear schedule that's unfolding at a very clear pacing that's trying to create a very specific emotion? Or is it like an open-ended space that has a shared intentional field where people can do whatever they want? It's more of a free-for-all where people can do and discover whatever they need to do. So that's sort of a lens for that interactive story. So, whose character is revealed when you're telling a story? Sometimes it's the character of an event, a person, place, or thing that you're showing. And maybe more on the generative side, it's your character that's being revealed through the process of being a part of a living story. And whether or not you're a ghost or embodied character. So you have a choice as to whether or not you have an embodiment or no embodiment, if you have impact on a story or no impact on a story that's unfolding. And again, so what is a good gathering? You can also think about from the lens of Aristotle's 4 causes. So you have like the formal cause, like the structure and the blueprint. You have the material cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. And the final cause here is what I would really point people to. This is the intention, the purpose, the teleological impulse. Like, why are you doing this? Why are you getting together? And it's that teleological impulse that if you're able to achieve that, then it's a successful gathering. So for learning, it's being able to find the purpose and the motivation and the intention to be able to interact and play, explore, create, chase your curiosity, find the motivation or purpose, engage in embodied movement, have the error correction code within the predictive coding theory of neuroscience, have novelty, surprise, answer your questions, and fail fast and adapt. So in the case of learning, these would all be, and this is just like one context of the educational context. Here could be some conditions for success. And I think whatever context you have, there's going to be a final cause and a purpose, and you kind of have to just kind of see what the feelings and needs are and then kind of work backwards from there. So all these other different ways that are trying to use different types of learning that are trying to achieve this. So, okay, fairly good start. Time to pause and take some more questions here from folks. So that was the second part of the brief response to the civic program and sort of exploring how I think about some of the experiential design stuff here.
Wow, fantastic, Kent. It's really amazing that you went back and kind of dissected the report that the students have been working on. Really, I think incredible for all of us to see the kind of, and incredibly useful for us to help make the report more meaningful for potential people that might use it, as we have many more months left to refine it and to improve it, so that eventually, hopefully, it becomes something. Obviously, the Mozilla Foundation's Internet Health Report was a kind of inspiration of something that, I mean, we use almost every day, kind of referring back to and referencing, as well as your interviews, of course. Just before we continue with some more questions, how many, you got another section or?
I have two more sections. If you want, I can go through it. It's going to be a little quicker, I think. I think that was the big bulk of the talk there.
Okay. Well, let's do 2 questions now then, maybe, and then
Yeah.
Eric.
We'll have some time at the end. Again, I have to leave at 10:45, which is an hour from now.
Yeah.
I'm happy to stay until then.
Great. Erica, do you want to go ahead? You were about to jump in before.
Yeah, I had a question about the self-expression part of it, either within conferences or within the more casual environment. I was wondering if you think that expression through the human body looking avatar versus something more abstract, how does that impact the ability to self-express? And if you have any ideas about what could be better ways to self-express? Either making everybody look the same so that you actually feel the aura that Athena was talking about, or is the opposite, like you really customize it to the extreme?
I think these are the different types of trade-offs that are going to yield different types of experiences that is like, as a cook, you're putting all these different ingredients in, and you can go to these different extremes, and depending on what you're trying to do is going to determine what those choices you make. But I'd say more generally, when it comes to the like VR chat, you have a whole wide range of different representations you can have. And I'd say what happens is that if you're a stick of butter, and it's someone you're talking to a stick of butter, and you have an experience of a stick of butter, like the person who is in that avatar representation of a butter is somehow like tapping into all of your life memories of butter, and like they are like leveraging that. Or it could be a good thing or a bad thing. Who knows? It could be positive or negative associations. I did an experience at Sundance where they gave us pop rocks, and so I did the pop rocks, and I had this feeling of it. But he asked me afterwards. He was like, "What was your experience of the pop rocks?" And as soon as he asked that question, a memory popped up, a clear memory. But before he asked that question, there was no memory. So what was that? What was my experience of the pop rocks before it crystallized into the memory, before he asked about it? And so that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with like a whole palette of associative memories of people. Like you can be whatever you want, and you're sort of leveraging that to sort of embody that, because you're saying the part of the essential character of this avatar is a part of me, and I want to embody that and express it. Whether that's a remedial measure for you to express your identity in a way, whether it's to explore your identity in a way, whether it's to be in relationship to the community in a way where you want people to treat you in a specific way because you're that character, whether it's you rating out that you're a big fan of this thing and you want people to interact with you, or if you're rating it that you're an absolute like enemy of this thing and you want to sort of embody your worst enemy of whatever that ends up being. For me, it would probably be like Donald Trump. Like what would it mean for me to embody Donald Trump in an avatar representation and deal with how people deal with me? Like what type of experience? So I think there's like, these avatars are like clothes, and just like fashion is able to like communicate all these different levels of symbolic meaning and sort of signal to people like our values and who we are based upon how we want to be in relationship to them. And I think just the same, we're going to have that with avatar representations. And the thing that is going to get really weird is we're going to start to have neural input into things of like moving our fingers to be able to like control the tentacles of an octopus. And we're going to be able to potentially start to have haptic feedback to be able to feel like we're actually embodying entities that are non-humanoid. You see a lot of non-humanoid, like hybrid animal creatures within VR chat. And so what does it mean to sort of start to embody the essential essence of those different animals? So yeah, I don't in my other sections here, I'll be talking a little bit about some of the fidelity spectrums of like photorealistic versus sort of stylized, because again, you have things like the uncanny valley where depending on where you feel, you're able to also invoke all these other either expectations. And I'd say it's probably like an expectation loop. So most people do highly stylized art because your expectations are not as high. As soon as you go to a stylized or photorealistic, you have such a high bar for what that is that your brain doesn't buy it. Like there's so many aspects of our micro expressions that we're just like, it looks like zombie-like, and it falls into the uncanny valley. And that ends up being a presence killer. So if there's anything, it's like leaning more towards the artistic stylized is what I see. Like, because as soon as people have like a photorealistic scan of themselves and they're just like this zombie in a T-pose, it's like, it feels gross. And we have trained in our bodies what it means to see people who are dying, like for millennia. And it's almost like someone with the plague that we're seeing, and we're like, that person has the plague and they're gonna kill me. And that's like, that's the type of like visceral reaction of the uncanny valley, is like, this person is so disgusting because they could be putting my life in danger. Because in the past, when people looked like that, they would literally be a danger to your life. So when you see people like that, we've trained in ourselves to be avoidant to that. So if anything, I'd say more towards the stylized, but all these other aspects of avatar representation and identity, that could be a whole talk within itself. That's just sort of like an overview.
Thanks.
It's like the Moopatar, no? Matter to place avatar that
exactly. Yeah. It sort of kills the feng shui, and it's
Should we take one more question, or
we can take one more.
If I could jump in,
Sure.
you really quickly skimmed through the part about early education, and I was wondering if you could expand on that, but also why had you separated the early education and higher education?
Yeah, I think early education is the type of things like you're learning the language. It's all the things that you do privately. In a lot of ways, there's different laws that come towards how information about students is treated. So there's actually some legal differences between early education and higher education, but there's also just this aspect of there's like a core curriculum that everybody growing up is going to need. But once you get into higher education, you're kind of like going off in your own specialization. So that's very different to be higher education, and also a lot of the training that comes for that type of higher education is like learning what to do if you need to handle nuclear waste. Like you're not going to be in an environment that's handling nuclear waste, but the types of experiences that you're doing are much more focused in terms of you need to do a very specific task. Whereas early education is like math, it's language, it's the stuff that everybody has to go through. And so there in early education also, what they found with the Google expeditions was that you could have one asset that could be applied for any class. It could be just an experience of being underwater, and you could have high school students use it, or you could have kindergarten students use it. And it's up to the teacher to determine how they use it. So there's also an aspect of being less specific to any specific context. It's just sort of a world that allows the people who are doing early education a little bit more freedom to see how they want to use it in their classroom. So there's a lot of distinctions like that I would make.
Great. The whole conversation around this and avatars and representation, you were saying you might jump into talking a bit about fidelity and things. So let's jump into the next part.
Part 3. All right. How are we doing? Is everybody doing good and having fun?
Yes, I think we're all really excited. And also there's questions coming in from Twitch and they will take later on. Yeah.
Yeah, so there was a section here on architecture and evolution that I was going to cover, and then I may do this and the design trade-offs, and just going to leave everything for questions at the end. So there was a section where you sort of got into the more technical tech architecture aspect. I had some thoughts on this because this is something I think a lot about. So Lawrence Lessig's pathetic dot theory is this sort of social economic control theory, meaning that you have 4 major dials to turn any sort of experience. You have the cultural norms, the culture, the law, the architecture, and the technological architecture, and the code, and the market. So with any issue, there's going to be a level of tech policy and law, the other market dynamics, and the centralized versus decentralized architectures, or open versus closed architectures, or just different design decisions. The Quest versus PC is a design decision. That's an architectural difference. And then you have the cultural norms, which is, what does the public think, and how do you educate people? How do you keep them informed about all this? It's the journalism, it's the media artifacts, it's the movies like The Social Dilemma to be able to educate people about some of these issues. It's the conversations that happen around the water cooler. It's all these things that are the zeitgeist of what people are talking about. So, the leverage that we have the most control over is this cultural norms. We can always educate people. We can always have the most agency there, because we can't always change the law. We can't always change the underlying architecture. And we can't always change the market dynamics, but we can always begin with the cultural norms. And you kind of like start with the cultural norms to then shift the law, shift the market, and shift the architecture. So that's one way to think about from a high level, how some of these other aspects start to come into play with the high level architecture here. But then there's the communications medium that I talked about before, the underlying technology, the makers making it, there's the distribution channels that are getting it into people's hands, and then audiences seeing it. And it's this feedback loop cycle that the VR medium is this dynamic process that's unfolding, and that as we learn new affordances through like experiences like Beat Saber, or a new experience like Burning Man, or the new Star Wars experiences, you start to see what is possible to affordance. You have people see it, they make sense of it, they match up their own experience, they talk about it, and they say, did you experience this? And then it's almost like a calibration for our phenomenological experiences. Our subjectivity now has an objective input that we can all experience pretty much the same thing. And then we can have then a discussion about our experiences about that. So when you look at the, different aspects of the architecture norms, you have the market that's connecting the makers through distribution channels to the audience. You have the law that is kind of like in between both the audience and the people and the technology. It's sort of like this big, it's connecting. And then you also have the cultural norms. It's also kind of the fabric over everything, and as well as the architecture, the technological architecture and the code is really focused on the underlying technology itself and all the under sort of the tech stack that goes into driving everything. So Simon Wardley is a sort of philosopher of technology. He's actually a consultant that has a lot of deep thinking, and he has a very process relational approach of thinking about technology. I wanted to just step through his framework because I think it's helpful to kind of think about not only the technology itself, where it's at, but also where it's going in the future. So we can see a whole century of technology diffusion of the telephone, electricity, the clothes dryer, microwave, VCR, the cell phone, computer, each technology distribution medium has gone through these different ways of kind of diffusing out into the world. And as it diffuses out, Wardley makes the distinction between what he calls technology evolution. So I'll give a high level view here and go back to this, but there's initially a prototype and a genesis. And then there's that's just like the duct tape prototype, just to prove out that that's even possible. And then there's a custom built enterprise application that is taking that idea and basically putting it into an enterprise use case. It's not widely distributed yet, but it's being used in a very specific context that's very custom and bespoke. And then eventually, if it's compelling enough, then that technology turns into a consumer product that is trying to reach the economies of scale and reach a mass of people that is really trying to take off. And then eventually it may or may not reach this level of ubiquitous commodity. You can think about like electricity as an example, or gasoline. There's literally no difference about where you get your gasoline or your electricity from. It's no different. Sometimes technology get there. I'd say like cell phones are still like on the cusp here of a consumer product and ubiquitous commodity. They're ubiquitous enough, but there's still enough differences between, say, an Android and iPhone that people can make a reasonable difference that there's still in this kind of edge of the consumer product, even though there's billions of people around the world that have the phone. They're ubiquitous, but they're not necessarily at that commodity point. So going through VR, so going back to here, Simon Wardley's map here is the genesis here. And then as you have the hockey stick starting to go up and have, more ubiquity, then you start to have the custom built, and then you have the product, and then you have the commodity. I think the biggest mistake in the XR industry is that a lot of folks just try to completely skip this custom built bespoke enterprise level. Like Magic Leap is a good example. They tried to like give a $3,000 AR headset that nobody could afford, and it wasn't really ready for prime time, as it were. So they kind of missed, and then they backtracked to be, okay, now we got to go back to the enterprise. Well, HoloLens was like, they were like, we're not doing consumer at all. If anything, the consumer, the enterprise aspect of VR started back in the 90s, and it's been there consistently. So you have the Sword of Damocles back in 1968. Then you have the VPL, and you have the cave systems that all through the 90s. You have these big companies and aerospace companies, automobile manufacturers that are producing different levels of these cave systems, these $1 million systems. So these systems are out there, and that's a lot of what actually Palmer Luckey was using to begin to use to reverse engineer and to deconstruct to be able to create the consumer version. So now we have the consumer version here, starting in 2012, but now you have all these different options that are out there. And then eventually, will we get to ubiquitous computing? We have some of these, what is essentially this form factor of glasses that could be both AR and VR, but, have all these different ways that we have spatial computing everywhere we go. I mean, there's certainly a lot of ethical issues as to whether we'll get there or not, but the point is that we have ubiquitous the technology to the point where just like everybody has it. So again, whether or not we'll ever actually get there, we still haven't got there with cell phones, but we're sort of arguably in the tip here. Potentially we'll get there eventually. So this tech evolution versus diffusion, the tech evolution, this is just from the last 7 years, which I found astounding, from the DK1 to Gear VR, DK2 to the Oculus Go and the Oculus Rift CV1 and the Oculus Quest to the Rift S and the Oculus Quest. This has only been like 7 years we've had this type of innovation from the DK1 to the Quest. I mean, if anybody's done this back to back, it's a little mind blowing just to see where we've come in the last like 7 years. But for each of these different iterations, it kind of like has a limit to how much it diffuses, and then it stops. And then eventually it sort of hits this sort of mainstream. And I think that's, you know, in some ways this is the evolution, and it's the same shape, but it's a little different. So this is a little bit more of that diffusion out of the Rogers diffusion, where you have this bell curve, but the bell curve is essentially the same as this S curve. It's just sort of, it doesn't go back down, it just goes up to 100. And so you have this diffusion out of the technology, and you have this crossing of the chasm. This is where I'd say like the Oculus Quest 2 is right now. Is it going to start to have this hockey stick of exponential growth as we start to continue into what has essentially been these innovators and early adopters into the next phase of this diffusion and the technology diffusion? We have this kind of broken up into these different sections here: the Genesis, custom, product. Now, again, that's not like a number that you hit and you're automatically in this phase. It's just sort of the evolution is more of like a phase shift from one to the next. All right, so I wanted to kind of use this Genesis, custom built, product, and commodity because Simon Wardley actually has this thing called Wardley maps. And what he does is that he tries to meld these two things together, like a map of the architecture of a system with what degree are they on this scale, as whether it's custom, hand built, bespoke, or productized, or if it's a commodity. So if we look at a traditional like website, you could see how like the power and the efficiency is over here in the commodity area, and then you have like the data centers and the compute. So we have like Amazon and versus Azure versus Google. There's still some differences between them here, but they're essentially moving here to the right, where it's kind of moving more and more to a commodity. The compute is moving more and more to a commodity. You have different aspects of the customer relationship manager, the platform, where this is all of the productized areas where you could just get commercial off the shelf. Anybody can just get this. You can get a website from Squarespace or Wix or whatever you end up getting. Now, when you start to get into this area, this is where like web applications start to get into like, these are the things like this is a photo sharing application where they're doing their own custom online photo storage with the customer and online manipulation. And maybe there's some like really cutting edge, innovative stuff that's never even been covered in academia before. But usually academia is in this realm where they're kind of figuring stuff out. They're proving out the theory, and then it gets handed off to the enterprise, and then it eventually gets them productized. But you can see just from any one piece of technology, you have this kind of ecosystem of different phases of evolution and development. And if anything, the competition is kind of driving things all to the right here. So you can see this as there's different types of people who have a center of gravity, where the people who really like want to be on the bleeding edge, where things are just broken and they want to just make stuff new that's never been done before. Those are the pioneers of that, like are doing the custom hand built aspects of an application. And then people who want to just like do the integration and the settlers, they're sort of tying these things together. And then the town planners, those are all the infrastructure people, the DevOps people, the people who are kind of managing all the infrastructure and stuff that doesn't change as much, but also you have to have like the firefighters. But you can kind of think of a different temperaments of people that are in these different areas. But again, each of these applications are kind of spanning a process that's in this unfolding. And the Gartner has this hype cycle where they try to list out the different technologies as they go from the innovation trigger, and then there's a peak of expectations. The media covers it, and they're like, "Oh my God, this is going to change the world." And then they get into the hands of people, and it's like, "Oh my God, this sucks." We're so far away from it's a slow climb of the slope of enlightenment, and then eventually to the plateau of productivity. This is from 2017, and AR and VR are here. You can see that VR is still here. It's on the slope of enlightenment. It's not even on the emerging technologies now. It's an established technology, and AR as well. It's at the point where both AR and VR I'd say AR is still on the slope of enlightenment. It's still on the way up, but VR is essentially on this plateau of productivity. But you can start to think about what is next, what's coming, and you can start to see, okay, these are the things that are kind of like the next wave, but we don't even have like custom enterprise solutions for these. These are still just like in the realm of theory. And then you start to get enterprise apps, and then eventually they become like consumer products, and then they become mass ubiquitous. But something like the hype cycle and matching it up with this type of Wardley mapping, where you have these triggers that are trying to move things. Like the open source is a trigger that moves things towards this commodity. So, every open standard has a proprietary competitor. From this was the tweet where that I literally tweeted at the moment that Neil Trevitt said it, and it's been such a clear thing of seeing how there's this dialectic between the closed and the open, this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, where having opposite ends of this closed and open has created this dialectic between the competition and cooperation, the walled garden, the open ecosystem, the curated content, and having no gatekeepers, the vertical integration that happens versus the horizontal platforms that are out there, like the open web, the proprietary aspect with the shared source code. So you have the app store model versus the instant access that's on the web. You could just get it through a URL. So this is every successful open standard has a proprietary competitor. So there's like a competition that happens between the open and closed. And I think that's an important thing to remember, that there's this dialectic and things are moving towards the open, but it always begins with the closed. And so even everything with VR is so closed, we're going to eventually have much more open alternatives. But we still have iPhone versus Android. And for people who are developers, there's people who get a lot more money developing for iOS than they do for Android. So there's certain fundamental problems with the yen currency, because people want everything for free and they're not willing to pay for stuff. Whereas people who have the yuan currency, they pay for the iPhone, they're willing to pay for experiences, and they pay for apps. And so the developer ecosystem is actually a lot more robust than the Android ecosystem. And the apps always get built for the iOS first. And there's a reason for that. So, okay, that's the technical architecture evolution. I'm going to go through this last part quickly, because it's not designed to go in detail. It's just more to give an overview here. So again, if I go into each of these different qualities of presence, there's different decisions that you can make for each of these different areas as a designer. And so for embodied presence, how are you going to distribute that? Is it going to be a mobile experience, a PC, location-based, enterprise application? Is it going to use tabletop scale, full scale, a giant scale? What type of volumetric capture? Is it going to be computer generated? Is it going to be completely volumetric capture, and all these different ranges of different types of capture is going to change your sense of embodied experience. So if you're in a volumetric capture with something that's been with Microsoft mixed reality versus something with depth kit, that's going to give you a different type of embodied experience, because you're going to be in this spatial experience of that. Then you have CGI geometry. Is it 2D texture, point cloud, polygon, voxels, all these different ways that you have even different types of geometry that you can use that changes modulates your sense of embodied and environmental presence. What kind of sound design do you have? You have 2D, some sort of stereo, ambisonic, or fully spatialized. The audio sources, are they recorded? Are they real time? Avatar embodiment. So do you have a ghost, or do you have hands, fingers, body, feet, eyes, facial expressions, body language? Biometric abstraction. So we're moving towards having more and more of this stuff. We're still way on this experience, but we're on this trajectory where it's going to be higher and higher fidelity of avatar embodiment and haptic feedback of different levels of haptic feedback that we're going to have, all the way down to having the holodeck and nanotechnology, more speculative aspects, and smell and different ways to doing smell within experiences, and EEG and measuring your brain waves to see vigilance, perception, motor, attention, decisions, each are a higher level of complexity of things you can see from non-invasive EEG, biometric feedback. And so again, moving from the heart rate variability, eye tracking, galvanic extreme response, the EMG, BCI, the brain control interfaces, we're on this trajectory of moving to more and more higher level fidelities of biometric feedback. And then the level of comfort, what kind of motion sickness are you invoking? And is it comfortable or not comfortable? And the mixed reality spectrum is it a real environment? Is it an AR environment? Is it totally virtual environment? And so to what degree is the environment modulated through AR or VR? So that's all the embodied presence and active presence. You have narrative agency. To what degree do you have impact on the story or no impact on the story? Can you move around? Is it completely on rails? If it is on rails, is it static or dynamic? Can you move around and have at least some agency? Or is it just total open world exploration where you teleport or have continuous locomotion? Can you see traces of your agency? So when you do some sort of action, can you see that trace? Is it completely chaotic and you see no trace, or do you see some sort of sweet spot where it's not totally predictable like it's a tool, but it does some sort of novel surprise where you see a trace of your agency, but it's in a way that you don't quite expect. And is it reactive to your behavior? So is it profiling you and listening to all your emotions and your behaviors? And is it is that being fed back into the experience in real time? So is the environment reacting to you as an individual? The interactions, are there buttons, are there gestures, are there embodied and intuitive or skeuomorphic, or are there eventually getting to these neural inputs? So that's all the active presence. The mental and social presence is, from the spectrum of a phone to video chat, spatial group chat, to the point where it just feels like you're in the same room with people, getting to the point where it's indistinguishable from reality. I think we're obviously a long way from that, but it's a trajectory of where we're going. Virtual beings, are they have pre-recorded dialogue? Can you interact with them? Are they artificial, general intelligent, or are they even super intelligent beings? That's more speculative. We may never get there. The uncanny valley. So the degree of fidelity, does it feel like it's more like a human or more like a non-human? This is where I was talking about earlier. When you get too close, you fall off the cliff, and it just completely ruins your presence because it's just totally disgusting. So the human likeness is just, in this weird, uncanny spot. So to what degree can you read your brainwaves and be able to know what you're seeing, what you're looking at and listening to, paying attention, being able to synthesize your intentions and your speech, and be able to translate your memories and your imagery? So not just like put a thing on your head and be able to translate what you're thinking into words, which already exist, but with invasive EEG, but be able to actually translate what your memories are and to translate that into memory, into these images. So are we able to eventually get to the point where we could just like imagine things, and from our imagination be able to manifest things within these virtual worlds? With BCI, that could be possible. So audience size is, how big is an audience? The sense of social presence. Are you alone? Do you have other people? Is it like hundreds of people? Is it like thousands of people? Or are there hundreds of thousands or billions of people in the same space? And finally, the emotional presence. And so to what degree are you a character or a ghost within the experience? Is it using real literal metaphors, or is it symbolic and kind of dreamlike? Or are those symbols personal to that individual? Or are they universal? Is it have a sense of time that has linear time, or is it branching or cyclical? So things that, are experiences of time, like interactive, like Superhot, where we're able to change the experience of time based upon it, or even branching into different outcomes based upon our actions. Are we able to empathize with whatever's happening? Is it on one scale of trauma tourism to feeling like you're able to really empathize and walk in someone's shoes? And being able to capture and reflect our emotions. So everything from no emotions to facial tracking, microexpressions, biometric abstractions, the synchrony. So to what degree is there synchronized movement between what you're saying and doing, and how that is being represented within the experience, to the point where you feel like you're in this group ritual with people doing these coordinated movements and actions, where you feel like you're a part of a larger whole. And the final point that I'd say here, well, just to sort of recap, those were the active presence, and starting with the embodied presence and the emotional presence and the active presence and the social mental presence. So each of those, there's for lots of different decisions to be made in terms of how you cultivate and modulate an experience. And I think as I watch through some of the other aspects of your talk, you also have a lot of these different things kind of sprinkled out through as well, starting to talk about these different things. And what I would encourage generally is to think about these as these equivalence classes. Like, what are you trading off? If you have, more mobile distribution versus enterprise, these are like spectrums in a scale, and really trying to feel like if you're going to compare things and put them in the same equivalence class, then how are they in relationship to each other? And the challenging thing with experiential design is there can be an infinite number of these spectrums. And so for me, I'm sort of using this high level, quality as a way to kind of, be an entry point, but there could be things that are not even in the way that I'm conceiving of things. And I think it's important to be open to other ways of imagining these different dialectics, because there are these dialectics between, the model and experience, your doubt and your belief, whether you're contesting, confirming, stabilizing, destabilizing, these things that are kind of mutually exclusive, but they're polar extremes where you're kind of going in between the two of them. Like, in order to believe truth is all about believing truths and avoiding falsehoods. And so education is like this balance between doubting what you know, but also believing what you know. You have to do both things at the same time, but it's impossible. They're two different algorithms, and you rely upon a deliberative process that happens through the community that helps to sort of explore what the doubts and what the truths are. So anyway, that's sort of a bit of epistemology, but at the core, it's this dialectic between the doubt and the belief, and the model and the experience. And I think that's just another way that I encourage to kind of see where are these mutually exclusive dialectical relationships that you really start to see a spectrum of choices that as you choose where you're on that spectrum, it modulates your experience. So that's it. That's the talk that I have. And it was nice to be able to say everything I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Ken. This was incredible. I would like to right away, I mean, I'm sure everyone is queuing up for questions, but I'm going to take one now. There is one more dial that I would like to ask, or like to add from our perspective as architects and people in architecture academia. We also have this weird dial, which is whether one should position a project in really trying to build for the current state of technology, or if one should instead do more of like the usual architectural project, which is envisioning something in the future, but the typical, especially architecture student project, stops in the drawing board. And that means that you could go far ahead into decades. And we often find ourselves, I mean, Frederick and I, we also do work where it's like immersive films that are speculating about the future of VR. People in the realm of architecture sees them and they understand that, they're projecting into the future. People maybe in the tech world comes and asks us if like, is this a product? This is amazing. Then we have to like, no, it's not a product, it's just an idea. So in a way, I wonder like, where are our projects most and our way of thinking now that you're a bit more acquainted with the architectural academia method? Where do we position ourselves?
Well, first I would say, given Gödel's, there's a bit of epistemic humility that I have that's like, it's literally impossible to get everything in. So there's always one more thing that you can't fit in, and that will go on forever, literally. There will always be new math until the heat death of the universe. So I think given a certain context for you as architects, I think it's important though, just to try to hit what those top things are, what those decision points are, and how you start to make these choices for creating these different experiences. And this question that you're asking in terms of the speculative nature of things versus, kind of going what I think of as the enterprise applications that are ready to be deployed today to someone who's willing to pay enough money for it, versus it's ready to be shipped on Oculus Quest, versus it's ready to like go viral and change the entire world and eventually be proven out in the virtual space, that then maybe people get inspired to build it and build effigies of it around the world. It's like you have the capability for space to go viral in the first way, in the virtual space, but also augmented reality spaces, people co-located to be able to come together or have these ideas that go out. And I think we need a lot of people to do the type of world building that inspires people and like is able to take some of the most intractable hard problems that we have and create like a protopian utopian vision of that. Because most narrative conceits is around drama and dystopia and death and destruction. It's like the worst possible, like it's like the idea that you have the drama come from the world, and that drama from the world is then driving the narrative. So because the world is so terrible, that becomes the narrative conceit. But with world building, you don't have to fall into that trap. You can make the world beautiful and inspiring, and actually embed values in a way that are just ideas now, but like taking it to its logical extreme of like, what if the entire world believed this type of process philosophy, as an example? Like, how would that be embedded into every aspect of life? And the context, I think, that I go through is a good world building template to be able to say, what does education look like? What does entertainment look like? What is your relationship to your home and family? What does medicine look like? What is your relationship to your friends? How do you express your identity? How do you deal with money and commerce? And so you can kind of go through each of those contexts, and those contexts become a template for a world. And every really successful narrative and world, like Star Wars, has very fleshed out visions for each of those. You watch a narrative and it's like, it's a fully fleshed out world. And I think that the model of context that I have is also just a model for world building, to think about that, and for for each, for design student, like for architects here, like I said, there's not a lot of experiences around death and grieving, not a lot around going on dates and romantic experiences and, you know, experiences for your parents that for you. And so there's certain areas that are like very niche that, you know, you could start to really be innovative and be like, hey, this is something that no one's really done yet. Let's like really push this to the logical extreme in terms of what kind of virtual spaces we can create. And the thing is, with VR technologies, it's already at the point of consumer. It's like skipped a couple of steps. You don't need to wait for the enterprise level. You can go straight to idea to like delivering it out to thousands of people, especially with WebXR. And as long as it's optimized, you know, as long as you have it, your bills paid, and you can, you're not necessarily relying upon it as a revenue stream. It's great if you're able to get that, but you are able to get stuff out to that scale, and it's able to get out to people. So I'd say shoot for the stars, you know, like to really be as speculative as you can. And as long as it's not like so high poly that it can't be seen by anybody in the world, then, you know, as long as you get it to be experienced, then, you know, you've functionally been able to create it in the world.
Thanks, Kent. I think that's very reassuring, both for us as the ones who set the topic for the study, but also for the students who are right now actually creating a context setting film, which is basically like establishing the context for their design project. So this couldn't be more on point. Guys, jump in with your questions. Last chances right now.
I'll be here until like 10:40 if anybody wants to stay on. So I have another 15, unless you guys have to leave, but
No, we don't.
I have a question. I listened to your podcast with Andrea Caggiocaro. It's probably not how you pronounce it. And I was really interested, like when she was talking about the relationship between like the philosophical consciousness and the brain. And I wanted to ask your opinion because in terms of my individual project, I'm looking into anonymous alcoholics meeting and how those could become virtual gathering spaces. So if you think about,
I'm sorry, I missed that, but you're making a gathering for who or for what?
AA meetings.
Oh, AA meetings, okay.
Yeah, so basically thinking about how to develop an architectural virtual gathering space for mental health. So starting from the AA meetings, and then it could develop to, in general, architectural healing. So I was wondering, like, your opinion in terms of like this relationship between the consciousness and the brain and the mind. And so do you think that in terms of like mental health, it could actually have like good implications, or because of this difference, maybe, I don't know, because of all of the time that people would spend in the virtual gathering space, then when they go back into the reality, it has some consequences in a way, or could it actually be something?
Yeah, we'll have two answers, one very pragmatic and one more philosophical. I'll start with the philosophical one first, which is that the nature of consciousness is a mystery. And the real deep answer to your question is like one of the deepest open questions in all of philosophy in terms of the nature of consciousness and the relationship to the body and mind. And but we don't need to answer that intractable hard problem of consciousness to be able to answer your real question, which is, can VR have an impact therapeutically? And the answer is absolutely yes. There's been decades of research on that. And then actually I recently did an interview with Brennan Spiegel, who has a book called VRX, how digital therapeutics are going to essentially revolutionize medicine. So the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States has actually classified this as an entirely new field of medicine called medical extended reality, MXR. And so it's a new branch of digital therapeutics, or digiceuticals, which is a terrible word. I hate that. Or like cyberdelics. You know, already Adam Ghazali has been able to get like a video game for, I think, folks who have autism, like prescribed to them as a treatment. So rather than getting medicines, you would get like a prescription for a video game, and you would go play the video game. And that's the direction that we're already going. And one of the more amazing aspects that I'll just share, this little anecdote that I got from Brennan Spiegel, was that there's this default mode network in your brain, which helps separate you as your ego and your identity and the outside world. When you take psychedelics, it totally like turns that off and you just have this unity experience with all of reality. Well, turns out that folks with schizophrenia have a weak default mode network, meaning that they have all these hallucinations of like the intrusive thoughts. And so he was telling me about this trialogue therapy that has a psychiatrist who talks to this patient with schizophrenia. Patient describes their demon and what the demon says to them. They create that demon in VR. And then the therapist embodies that demon and mimics all the words that you said, which on the face of it, be like, that sounds like a terrible idea. Why would you do that? Well, you would do that because you're trying to teach the patient to be able to have a sense of being able to fight back and to be able to have a strong, to cultivate a strong sense of their own sense of self versus what is coming from outside of themselves. And by having this sort of psychodrama within VR, they're able to actually have like results that are better than what medicine can produce. So you imagine like what type of like narrative, psychodrama, immersive theater type of experiences that people are going to be engaged with and what kind of like therapeutic impact that's going to have on them. Like we have no idea where this is going to go. But if you listen to the interview that I did with Brennan Spiegel, it'll give you some inklings around what the research is of what's already happening in terms of pain reduction and everything else. And the whole area of medical XR, to me, I think is one of the most interesting because it's like, it is that interface between objectively being able to prove the interface of things that are received through our consciousness and into our body and having impact on our bodies. It's this interface between the mind-body connection, and the people who are doing medical VR are on the bleeding edge to see what is the affordances of this medium, what can we do with this, and to see how they're able to use this in therapeutic applications. But eventually that'll get into like consciousness hacking applications that everybody's doing at home, just like they're doing Beat Saber.
Thank you.
Hi again, I'm Sue, a fourth-year student, and I want to ask that what are we supposed to be aware about when we're going to bring ideas of religious event or ethnic festivals such as Day of the Dead into virtual world?
Well, I would say first and foremost, it's really important to be in really deep relationship to the communities that you're doing this with and for, and to have them have a lot of directorial, editorial oversight. And, you know, the Smithsonian Museum, the Latino Smithsonian Museum, like I briefly mentioned, there's a number of museums in Washington, D.C., but there's not enough budget for the Latino Smithsonian Museum, which means that they've had to be virtual for their entire existence. And so they've had to use things like Second Life and work with their population of Latinx folks here in the United States to be able to create these types of virtual experiences. And so in a lot of ways, they've been on the bleeding edge of like Instagram and adopting all these like just social media and immersive technologies because they've had to out of necessity. But I think it's important that there are a lot of cultural nuances, and it's important to be just in relationship with the folks that are involved with that, and just make sure that it doesn't get totally appropriated in the sense that, you know, there's a lack of editorial oversight. And I think, you know, this process philosophy and being in deep relationship, all my relations, and, you know, really taking that to the extreme where, you know, there's a certain editorial process sometimes that happens where like you maybe get someone to sign an image release form, and then you basically have colonized that piece of content. You can do whatever you want. But what if you don't have them sign that release form? I mean, legally you may still have to, but what if you structure it so that they have co-ownership over that, so that they can actually have some say over how they're being represented. If they're not in direct control, at least they're able to have some sort of veto power. And I think this starts to get into a lot of what the area of the ethics of documentary has been getting into for a long time. So this is not like a totally new area that is totally green, that the ethics of documentary is something that I know that Mandy Rose gave a talk at MIT, and I was able to comment on that. I think that video may be online somewhere, but she goes a whole hour-long presentation, and I make some comments on it afterwards, where she really dives into the ethics of documentary, which I think is, you know, this interface between this kind of cultural cultural heritage type of projects that have a documentary feel. So the ethics of documentary have a lot to say on that as well. Yeah, welcome.
We've got a question also from someone, from Deborah, who is in a time zone where she had to leave, and it was kind of building up on what Lara was talking about, which is the role of the architect. And you have had a chance through some of the sessions when you came to the symposium at the AA in London to kind of see architects' perspectives on this. And she was asking if, like, how would you describe from your experience architects' possibly unique or different view on this field and the kind of unique contributions that architects might give, and maybe also I would end, how could we as architects do that?
I think if I look at the sort of quality of presence that I sort of fit architecture in, it's like this sense of embodied and environmental presence. And I think architects in particular have been cultivating that sense of intuition in terms of like designing things and experiencing things and knowing how they're going to feel when you're in the same place as them. I know Andrea Katsucaro says that there's always a gap between the design and the experience of it. And I'm sure there's still a gap between the virtual and the real. But being able to see a virtual representation and actually seeing it, there's still probably some gap. But the thing about architects is that they're able to have these iterations where they're able to minimize that gap and they're able to get maybe closer sooner. And that they're, because they're spatial first and embodied first, then there's a kind of center of gravity there of really being attuned to how the space is related to someone's overall experience. And I think so many times you have what I would say like is uninspired or disposable architecture where, you know, you have something like the early versions of Verbella where you have this whole virtual world and it's nice to walk around and then you get into the room and it's a big box that is just like any other box at a conference center. And it's like, come on, can't we have like something that's not a box? Can we be on the moon? Can we have something interesting to look at? Can we see like, and I think this is going to be moving forward. How can you have shape and space that has some sort of symbolic communication that's able to modulate someone's embodied experiences in a way that is able to be predictable or to be able to design something and be like, once people walk through this corridor and get this sense of small and shrinking, then you're able to like have something big. And so you have this sense of the treating space as you're locomoting through space and having this time, like treating locomotion through space as a time-based medium of the consonance and dissonance of the building and releasing of tension. And so how do you, what type of physical things can you put in a world to be able to play with that building and releasing of tension as you're moving through a space? And I think that's where that's what all architects are all doing. And for me, I'm the most interested in what the architects are doing because they produce the most interesting spaces that have the most considerations. And they think about all the little things that I think is part of the training. Yeah, and I think if anything, it's the architects that are becoming more and more like game designers. And so the bleeding edge, the cutting edge is what does dynamic and reactive architecture look like? How can you use space that is giant and sort of physics defying in a way that we've never seen before? I think we have experiences that are in some VR experiences that you know, at the end of some experiences that you start to experience some of those types of awe-inspiring moments that start to play with that. But, you know, really grounding someone into a set of expectations and then perverting it at the end with something that's just sort of like, what? How do you even do that? A good experience, I'd say, folks haven't seen Terminus. I would recommend that's a good one for architects to see because they're actually playing a lot with spatial modulation and dynamic architecture in a way that starts to kind of, I think, push the ball forward in terms of what's possible.
Can I just ask 2 more questions building on from that? Have you had yourself consciousness altering experiences? That's one. And the other one, looking at the Fermi paradox of why we haven't heard from aliens yet, and the 2 kind of explanations. Sorry?
I said that's debatable.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
But anyway, go ahead. Carry on. I would question that there is evidence out there, but go ahead.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Assuming that there hasn't been.
Yeah. Assuming. Yeah. So the 2 explanations of that, one being that all intelligent life self-annihilates, and the other one being that there's no point in putting your body into danger and going into space. That with time, obviously all the VR technologies and immersiveness becomes so advanced that you don't need to do that. So you just end up plugged into a machine, and that's much more rich than you could ever achieve in space. So what would you say in terms of like what is more probable for our civilization, self-annihilating or immersing forever?
Just an easy last question.
Yeah, yeah, you know, in on the light ones. I'll start with the alien one. First of all, there's been a lot of evidence that there has been a lot of sightings and other stuff that of some sort of, I mean, the New York Times has reported on UAPs. They have a whole UAP task force. If you search for Kent by UFO or UAP on Twitter, you'll see a whole thread where I've been covering this for the since December 17th of 2017. But if just sort of take the VR aspects, they already have Jeff Norris that talked about telenauts, so that projecting your consciousness into a robot. This is when he was working at NASA and sending robots out into space, and to be able to like sort of imbue the space exploration. Now, there's a line of sight issue, which is like usually with as you move your head around, you know, there's a time that it takes for that to happen where there's such a delay that you don't have that sense of same virtual telepresence at a galactic scale, let's say. But if you have something like quantum computing that has quantumly entangled and quantum communication that uses the spooky action at a distance to be able to instantaneously communicate past the speed of light, then we may have some really interesting stuff when it comes to the speculative future of quantum computing when it comes to the exploration of space. Do I think that one of the other is more likely? I think that there's a good chance that some of the potential alien life forms that have alleged alien life forms that have come here have been artificial intelligent entities that have, you know, have some sort of sentient consciousness that's either in direct communication or not. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of more speculative. For me personally, I think there's more mundane evidence of something that's interesting going on. And the first, remind me, what was the first question again?
Have you ever experienced consciousness altering? Yeah.
So I've done sound self. That's probably the closest that I've had. I haven't had any, I would say, like altered states of consciousness. I've done psychedelics. I've done shamanic breath work. So I think like holotropic breath work matched with something could be interesting. I know that there's someone named Carl H. Smith who is doing a lot of stuff with the melding and mashing up of, you know, doing phased things like doing a little bit of breath work, doing psychedelic, doing an immersive experience, and kind of like going back and forth. And, you know, as I live in Portland, Oregon, which psilocybin and all drugs have been decriminalized, but being able to use psilocybin in controlled studies, the MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, is on the roadmap of being able to use psilocybin as a FDA-approved drug. It's in like this phase 3 trial. So we have this, we're on the cusp of a psychedelic revolution, essentially. It's coming. And when I went to the Awaken Future Summit, I did a whole podcast series of talking to the intersection of psychedelics and VR. VR is likely going to be a primer or a screener or a decompressing. So to maybe get your mind into the right mindset, and then you go into starting to help set the larger set and setting, and then going into an altered state of consciousness through a psychedelic. And then as you come out, maybe it's kind of offboarding to help you go from the psychedelic experience back into the real world. But it also could be like a screener. Like if you have issue with this immersive experience, then maybe you shouldn't be doing the psychedelic, or it could be a way of kind of revealing if there could be issues. I do think that there's neurochemical aspects of like turning off the default mode network as an example. And that's just something that is hard to do just through your consciousness. It may be possible eventually through the cyberdelics and consciousness hacking. I mean, we'll see. I mean, it's very early days for where all this is going to go and what's even possible and what kind of latent human potentials will even be untapped as we continue on this road. So we're still too early to really know for sure, but yeah, I'm certainly excited about it. And I wouldn't say that I've had any virtual reality mediated experience that's matched any sort of psychedelic, you know, chemically based experience that I've had yet. But I think eventually at some point, and sound self is probably the closest that I've had in terms of having that. And I highly recommend people check that out just as an audioactive experience. So
cool.
Well, Kent, we're miraculously out of time. It felt like we just got started. Like there are many more questions that I think we just hope we can have you back at some point.
Yeah,
it's really incredibly
happy to come
valuable
back
for
later as you move further down the road. I know I just sort of one additional closing thought is just I gave my experiential design framework is something I've been working on for like the last 6 years, and it's like I'm very committed to it. But you could have the 5-element approach. You could do Chinese philosophy. You could do so many different ways of just setting different philosophies. There's an infinite number of ways you could do this. So there's no one right answer. It's just for me, this is what I use and I find it helpful. So hopefully you've been able to get some reflection, and I don't know where you'll go from here, but yeah, just hopefully it'll help at least provoke some thinking around how to kind of think about it and structure it. And yeah, the deepest feedback I have is to really think about those equivalence classes and to see how each of these things, when you have a group of 4 things, how are those 4 things related to each other? Because sometimes it's like, how is that related? It's sort of arbitrary. So to really kind of interrogate and to maybe have a whole spectrum where there's a little bit of choices that a designer can make as you are putting all of this together.
It's truly meaningful for us, and we're obviously very grateful that we didn't just have you here now, but we also have you here. And I just wanted, for also people that might watch this later on, please go to Kent Bai's Patreon page, and if you appreciate the work he's doing, we certainly have appreciated you here today. It's been a real honor to have you back at the AA and at the unit. I'm going to stop the stream here.